Let's stay with that State of the Climate report, which is being released by the CSIRO and the Bureau of Meteorology this morning.
To discuss it, we're joined now in the studio by Dr Megan Clark, the Chief Executive of the CSIRO, and Dr Rob Vertessy, the Acting Director of the Bureau of Meteorology. Good morning to you both.
Good morning. Good morning.
Now, these cooler temperatures are as a result of the La Nina weather pattern. Just how much has Australia cooled off?
Over the last 2 years, last year's been a little bit warmer than the average over the long term, and the year prior was a little bit warmer than the average, in fact. So the dent in global temperature has been actually quite small, in fact.
How much are we looking at in terms of both sea and land temperatures rising, or how much have they risen, and what are you forecasting in the years and the decades ahead?
Air temperatures have risen by about 1 degree centigrade over the last century, and the ocean temperature has increased by about 0.8 of a degree over the last century. Sea levels have risen by about 210 centimetres over the last century as well, and the projections are for further increases in temperature and sea level.
And I think we can just take a look at the way the average temperatures over land have changed, and if you can just talk us through this graphic, we can bring it up.
What we're seeing here is the decadal trends, so in the grey boxes, and it's important to look at the trends as we see each decade, and you can see there from the 1950s onwards, you can see that each decade has been warmer than the decade we've had before.
And we can also bring up a chart showing the global average mean sea level. Equally, if you could just talk us through what seems like a pretty easy to explain chart there.
Well, as Rob has outlined, the sea level's risen by about 21 centimetres. That's about the span of a human hand. And of course, put that into context, that's been since 1880. But when we couple that, of course, with storm surges, we can impact our coastlines.
And I guess what's interesting about that as well is that the sea surface temperatures have increased faster than the global average. Is that correct?
Yes, we've seen the sea surface temperatures again showing decadal trend for over 100 years, where each decade the sea surface has been warmer, the temperatures each decade moving up. So we've seen this consistent trend, not just on the land, as Rob's outlined, but also in our surface sea temperatures over decades and over a long time.
Let's bring up the next chart, which I think focuses on CO2 concentration in the southern hemisphere. Talk us through this when it pops up.
Well, as you can see, this is a long time series going back 1,000 years, and it shows the concentration of various greenhouse gases in the atmosphere all rising very sharply since the Industrial Revolution. What we find now that the CO2 concentration of the atmosphere is at about 390 parts per million, which is well outside the natural range over the last 800,000 years.
Now, you're talking in this report about rising temperatures and the like, but you can be forgiven for thinking as, say, a viewer in Sydney who's just lived through this unseasonably cool summer, lots of rainfall, looking at this report and saying, you've got to be kidding me.
Well, you're right. What we've experienced 2010, 2011, we know for that 2-year period, that's been the wettest two-year period that we've had on record, and that's what we're feeling. And as Rob is outlining, we've had some cooler temperatures over the La Nina, some of the coolest ones since 2001. But what you're seeing in these observations, these long-term trends, is that even with this variability, that's a characteristic of Australia's climate, our droughts and flooding rains. Even with this variability, we see this long-term warming trend.
And lots of people have got the mistaken assumption that because there's been so much rain, sadly too much rain, as we've seen in recent weeks in parts of Australia, that droughts are a dim, dark memory. But as you say, the way Australia's weather pattern has been now for centuries, droughts and possibly really severe droughts are sadly inevitable.
That's right. You can see that in the record that we're sharing with the Australian people, with the Bureau and CSIRO together. You can see that in the past record, this variability of our droughts to flooding rains. But we have seen a warming trend, and we've seen a very warm La Nina event.
And it's actually very dry in southern parts of Australia, isn't it?
Well, southwest Western Australia has shown that consistent less than average rainfall, and also we're seeing that shift in the nation from the rain being in the winter, which we're used to the summer and spring rain.
So in the interim, how long can we expect this La Nina weather pattern to keep affecting temperatures?
The La Nina is now breaking down, and we won't know until around the middle of the year whether it will come back. The odds of it coming back a third year in a row are probably a little less than average. Yeah, we will only know really in the middle of the year. One thing we should say about this last La Nina, it's important to understand that although we might felt a little bit cooler here in Australia, last year in fact was still the 10th warmest year on record over the last century, and the year before, the first year of the La Nina, in fact was the hottest year in the global record. So it was actually a rather unusual La Nina, the warmest one we've ever had.
Rob Vertessy and Megan Clark, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you very much.